So our first panel this morning, we're going to hear about the ethical challenges of emerging technologies quite generally and how these challenges can inform our understanding and approach to the topic of incidental findings. We'll hear from each speaker for 10 minutes, and then we're going to open the session for questions and discussions. A quick reminder, when you speak, make sure you've turned your mic on and the red light will come on. And we will begin with our first speaker, Dr. Ruth Schwartz Cowan, who is the Janice and Julian Burrs Professor Emerita at the University of Pennsylvania. Special welcome, Ruth. Prior to that, Dr. Cowan was the Director of Women's Studies and the Chair of the Honors College at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and Chair, where she currently is Professor Emerita of History. Dr. Cowan is the author of 6 books and numerous articles. She's also been a Fulbright Scholar, a Guggenheim Fellow, Phi Beta Kappa Lecturer, and Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Scholar at Caltech. She is active in and the former president of the Society for the History of Technology and serves on the editorial boards of Social Studies of Science and Science and Culture. And Dr. Cowan is currently working on a history of American women engineers, a study of risk communication with regard to prenatal diagnosis for Down syndrome, a revision of her textbook on a social history of American technology, and a history of the National Academy of Science. And in her spare time, she has agreed to speak with us. Welcome, Dr. Cowan.
It's really a pleasure to be retired. This is what Penn faculty do when they retire. More than 30 years ago, I started a research project on the history of amniocentesis. And this project arose from my own experience 33 years ago, almost to the day, of amniocentesis. And it emerged also from my ethical concerns about what I had just been through. And in the course of doing this research, I came to the conclusion that the tools that historians of technology have developed over the years should be and can be and have been applied to the study of bioethical issues. It's not just the tools of philosophy and not just the tools of law, but also the tools of history or the findings of investigations in history. The insights of historians of technology are really important to understanding the bioethical quandaries that arise when new technologies emerge. And so that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. I'm going to make 5 points very quickly, but I'll try to illustrate them also quickly with salient examples that come out of my research on the history of prenatal diagnosis. So, salient point number 1, salient insight: all technological changes and all scientific discoveries that lead to technological changes have unexpected outcomes. They have expected outcomes, that's why they get to be technologies, but they also have unexpected outcomes. So here's an example. In the late 1950s, a French physician, Jérôme Lejeune, used a new technology, which we have come to call karyotyping, to examine the chromosomes of his patients who had Down syndrome. He was hoping for a particular outcome. He was hoping to find a therapeutic intervention or a cure for Down syndrome. A decade later, however, he was appalled to discover that there was an unexpected outcome of his research, and that is that his discovery was being used not to treat or to cure, but to prevent the birth of infants with Down syndrome. And he acted on his appalling discovery. That is, he was one of the principal scientific objectors to abortion for fetal indications. So that's point number 1. All technologies that we've studied have had unexpected outcomes. Point number 2. A technology needs to be part not just of a technological system, but of a socio-technical system in order to have any outcome at all. A simple way of understanding this is to say that a nail needs a hammer and the hammer needs a carpenter in order for there to be some outcome of that technological system, socio-technical system, because there's a carpenter in it. Karyotyping is a system, just like all the others, which consists of osmotic solutions and microscope and skilled technicians in order to have an outcome. So we can say that the problem that Lejeune discovered as a result of his discovery that his work on trisomy 21, his discovery of trisomy 21, was being used to prevent the birth of patients like the ones he was caring for, was really an unexpected outcome to him because his discovery had become embedded in a socio-technical system of prevention, not a socio-technical system of diagnosis and treatment, which is what he had expected. Third insight. Inventors and discoverers are really not able to predict unexpected outcomes. They are not experts on what they didn't expect to have happen. Because they are, and they must be, focused on the outcome they are hoping for. They don't pay much attention, and they may not even be able to pay attention to the outcomes that are unexpected. They cannot envision any other socio-technical system in which their discoveries might become embedded. It's another way of putting it. Here's another example. In the 1950s, a Scottish obstetrician gynecologist by the name of Ian Donald spent almost a decade fiddling, the jargon word for fiddling is developing, an ultrasound device, that he was fiddling with ultrasound devices that were being used in Scottish shipyards to detect fractures in steel plates, not visible to the human eye, fractures in steel plates. He was developing this technology so that it could visualize uterine cysts and tumors in his patients who were so obese that X-rays could not penetrate the dense adipose tissue in their abdomens. Took him almost a decade to get what we now call gynecological ultrasound perfected. He never once during that decade suspected that a decade later, his invention of gynecological ultrasound would become embedded in a socio-technical system of obstetric ultrasound, and that pregnant women would soon start asking for copies of the ultrasound images of their fetuses to show to their families and friends. It's an example of what happens when a particular technology becomes embedded in a technological system for which it was not intended. Fourth insight, every participant in a socio-technical system has, and I emphasize these modifiers, multiple and legitimate interests in that system. And not all of these interests are financial, which means that not all of them can be captured in conflict of interest statements. A researcher, for example, may have a financial interest in the research that she's doing, but she may also have an altruistic interest in the research. That is, she's doing the research in order to provide better health care for people. She also may have professional interests in the research. That is, this research will enhance her reputation. It will enable her to get more grants and keep her laboratory going. It will defeat somebody else's hypothesis about, we do that sometimes. So there are multiple interests that a researcher has in the research that she's doing, and not all of them are financial. A clinician may have an interest in, and undoubtedly does have an interest in, reducing the suffering of her patients, of his patients. I switched gender in my notes. A clinician may have an interest in reducing the suffering of his patients at the same time that he has an interest in improving the bottom line of his practice. And both of these are legitimate interests, and they might, on occasion, conflict with each other. A manufacturer of diagnostic devices may have an interest in increasing the profits derived from those devices, partly to please the shareholders in her corporation, but partly to fund development of better diagnostic devices, which is what, in fact, manufacturers do sometimes, often, with their profits. A patient may have an interest in getting better health care, undoubtedly does have an interest in getting better health care, at the same time as he may want to pay less for that care. So there are interests that are financial and there are interests that are not financial, and many of them, probably most of them, are from the perspective of the participant in the system, legitimate. This point leads me to my concluding relevant insight that I have derived, and I hope you will agree is worth deriving, from studies in the history of technology. There are no disinterested, truly objective parties to bioethical disputes that arise when new biomedical technologies emerge. Everyone has an interest of some sort in the development of those technologies and the use of those technologies in a system. And that means, I believe, that sound bioethical policy requires, first, careful delineation of those interests. That's what historians can do. And second, thoughtful balancing of them, which is what you get to do.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, we're going to have all speakers and then open it up for questions to anybody. Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Green, who is the Associate Director for Research at Partners Healthcare Center for Personalized Genetic Medicine and an Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Genetics at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He is a medical geneticist and physician scientist who directs the Genomes to People research program in translational genomics and health outcomes, and he co-directs the NIH-funded PGen study, which is the first prospective study of direct-to-consumer genetic testing services. He's a principal investigator of the MedSec project, the first NIH-funded research study to explore the use of whole genome sequencing in the clinical practice of medicine. Dr. Green also co-chaired the Incidental Findings Working Group that recently published recommendations for the management of incidental findings in clinical exome and genome sequencing. Welcome, Dr. Green.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman and Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. It's a true pleasure to be here and speaking to you. I'm going to take you on a quick overview of some of our research over the past 12 years that pertains to these issues, and slow down a little bit at the end to tell you a little bit about our ACMG recommendations that were just released. My disclosures are shown there. I do work with some of the direct-to-consumer companies, as you'll hear, in a collaborative arrangement, but do not accept any funds from them. My work is primarily supported by NIH research, for which I am deeply grateful. The path to genomic medicine is currently working predominantly in understanding the biology of genomes and the biology of disease, but the leading edge of this is already in the advance of science to medicine and improving effectiveness of healthcare. My program, which we call Genomes to People, does clinical research, data-driven studies in genetic epidemiology, randomized clinical trials on the impact of genetic information, and comparative effectiveness research. The very first question we got involved in almost a dozen years ago was, is genetic information dangerous? Which is one of the contentions that's at the heart of the incidental finding controversy. And just to review for those of you who are not aware, we used as a model ApoE genotyping, which does indicate an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, a very scary disease and currently untreatable and unpreventable disease. When we started this in the year 2000, this was a very frightening proposition. We were really lambasted on all sides for actually disclosing this kind of information to individuals, but we approached it through a randomized clinical trial that ended up demonstrating that when you compared the disclosure of ApoE, even E4, to people who had not had it disclosed, there were no group differences, anxiety, depression, or distress on validated measures. We looked at this in many different ways, but it turned out that people really wanted this information, and those who sought it out would do it again, that they attached a great deal of value to it, both financial and other types of value to it, that they, in contrast to some prevailing narratives about genetic risk information, they actually did something with the information. Even they tried to do exercise, vitamins, medications to reduce their risk. Sometimes they did things we might not necessarily agree with. People who learned they were at greater genetic risk actually went on the internet and tried to purchase unregulated supplements, more commonly than people who learned they were E4 negative. And as you might imagine, people who learned they were E4 positive, an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, were 5 times more likely to purchase long-term care insurance. A very rational response, but one that scares the pants off of the insurance industry. And
There are no disinterested parties.
exactly. Exactly. Remind me to tell you about presenting this at an insurance company outing. So now I'm going to show you some less published, some newer data that hasn't actually been fully published yet. One of them we call dosing the disclosure, which is what happens when you try to imagine genetic information presented in the context of an ordinary medical encounter. We actually did a randomized trial where we condensed the entire protocol to something you might do in a doctor's office, a brochure that informed you, a blood draw, and a question and answer session. And I'll show you one slide that suggests that the condensed protocol was not more distressing than the extended protocol, and that there was very little difference when the condensed protocol was applied by genetic counselors versus medical doctors. We also did an entirely separate randomized trial we call diluting the disclosure, which pertains to incidental findings. Right. And in this situation, we got all these folks who said, yes, I want to learn my risk of Alzheimer's disease. We randomized them, and then in one arm of the study, we surprised one group with a risk of heart disease. As it turns out that ApoE is also a genetic risk factor for heart disease. Now, this was fascinating because we took these individuals, randomized them in this way, and as you might imagine, when people found out they were at both increased risk for Alzheimer's disease and increased risk for heart disease, they were more likely to do something about it. In this case, to say they were going to exercise more. And you can see that on the right side of the slide, the E4 positives were much more likely to say they're going to exercise if they found they were at risk for both Alzheimer's and heart disease. But this next slide was truly surprising. On the left side, you see all the people who are E4 negative, and if you're E4 negative, you're about the same regardless of which arm you were randomized to. If you find out you're E4 positive, you have a bit more distress, obviously, finding out that you're at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, although this is all below clinical cutoffs. That distress is substantively mitigated by finding out that you're also at risk for heart disease. Now, on the face of it, that makes no sense. You've just found out you're at risk for 2 diseases rather than 1. But there's something about finding out either 2 pieces of information or finding out 1 piece of information you can't do much about plus another piece of information you can do something about that seems to mitigate the overall distress. And perhaps this is a clue to why there hasn't been more distress when people receive these large panels of information. So we're exploring these data, and we think it's quite fascinating. Now, we got funded a couple years ago to examine direct-to-consumer experience, which, after all, is a kind of naturalistic experiment in incidental findings. You may have something you're particularly interested in when you order direct-to-consumer testing, but you're really not thinking probably about all 70 of the things you might get back on the health panel. And for this, we work with two companies, 23andMe and Pathway, and we gave customers a survey before they got their results, a survey after they got their results, and a survey at 6 months after they got their results. And this is the first study where the customers who are participating in the study also agreed to give us all their genetic information. So we were able to see in this study what they thought they were getting, what they actually got, and what they thought they got. And we're just getting this data in now. I can only give you a slide or two for a teaser, but I think it's fascinating. Here, among the first 1,000 people who have gotten to 6 months, about 27% reported that they've already discussed their results with their doctor. Versus only 3%, geneticists have discussed them with an actual genetics specialist. As with other surveys, about 10% said these results prompted them to make an appointment with a medical professional, and about further 10% actually had some sort of test, exam, or procedure as a result of the information they learned with their direct-to-consumer genetic testing. Now, what were the predictors of having this test exam? Well, obviously, there's sort of a tautology here. Talking to your doctor about this was a strong predictor of whether you were going to get some sort of test or exam. But look at some of the others. People who perceived that they did get above average risks were 9 times more likely to get tests, exam, or procedures. People who already thought they were in good health were more likely to do this. People who had higher anxiety were more likely to do this, and people who had a pre-test intention to sort of integrate this with their care were more likely to get this. This is important because one of the key questions is, does any kind of incidental finding in any of these contexts lead to increased downstream costs and medical utilization? We've been one of the leaders in the CSER research group, where we have the MedSeek projects, which is a randomized clinical trial in patients with disease and in healthy patients, looking in each group at using whole genome sequencing to see basically what happens when you try to use whole genome sequencing in the practice of medicine. I'm going to skip ahead because we've created a one-page results report. If you can imagine all this complexity, with Heidi Ream of the LMM at our place, we have developed a one-page report that we think, with a little bit of training, even a primary care doc can utilize. Here's the top half of that page. You can see there's a section on monogenic disease risk. Here's the bottom half of that page. Carrier risks are identified, as well as pharmacogenomic associations. You know, the question of incidental findings has been plaguing us and is the subject of today's commission. We actually took that on with a specific survey of a selected group of leaders in genomics, and we got some very interesting results. We were able to get concordance for a small set, but look at the difference between these three specialists. The specialist on the left thinks it's a pretty good idea to use to report known pathogenic mutations, truncating mutations, but thinks it's a terrible idea to report back missense mutations. The specialist in the middle thinks it's a really good idea to report back known pathogenic mutations and a sort of an okay idea to report back truncating and missense. The specialist on the right, clearly studied at the School of George Church, believes it's a great idea to report back known truncating and missense mutations. So what ultimately is the right analogy for this? Is the radiology analogy right? I'll just wind up with these two slides on ACMG recommendations, which came out along with my co-chair, Les Biesecker. We developed incidental findings, a specific list of conditions and genes which we recommend that any laboratory doing whole exome or whole genome sequence report back, not to the patient, but to the ordering clinician who can put that into context. These recommendations diverge from current genetics practice in two important ways. We suggest systematically reporting these positive findings without trying to seek the patient's preference about these very low probability results, just as we would in the rest of medicine. And we suggest reporting the same list regardless of the age of the patient. and it's beyond the scope of this talk, which I need to stop, but we believe this converges, these recommendations, with the rest of medicine. So I'll stop with this slide in honor of Dr. Wagner's interest in restoring antique cars. Up in the upper left hand is the Cardier's Fardier à vapeur, the first handmade car, which then gave way to where we are now in genome sequencing, the early manufacturing, and as we look to the future, where an entire car may be able to be grown in a genetically engineered petri dish. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green. Both Dr. Cowan and Dr. Green have given us a lot to think about, and our last speaker on this panel is Dr. Mildred Cho, who is the Associate Director and Professor of Pediatrics at the Center for Biomedical Ethics at Stanford University. Post-PhD, Dr. Cho was awarded a Pew Fellowship in Health Policy at UCSF. Dr. Cho was also a fellow at the Center for Healthcare Evaluation at the Palo Alto Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Prior to a position at Stanford, Dr. Cho was Assistant Professor of Bioethics in the Center for Bioethics and the Department of Molecular and Cellular Engineering at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. Her research interests include the ethical and social issues of genetic research, stem cell research, genetic testing, and relationships between academia and industry in biomedical research. Welcome, Dr. Cho. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ethical frameworks and practical challenges of thinking about incidental findings. I'm really going to only talk about this in the context of genomic research, but I think you already have a very good idea of how these may or may not apply to the other contexts. So I think some of the ethical frameworks that have been put forward for looking at incidental findings really follow the frameworks for looking at findings in general. What do you do with diagnostic results? What do you do with medical information? And a lot of these focus, I think, appropriately on sort of judging and weighing the risks and benefits of giving the information, of not giving the information, and what they may or may not do to an individual's autonomy. In the context of incidental findings, those principles have to be weighed against sort of the different responsibilities of the individuals involved in the different contexts, which you already have outlined: research, clinical, direct-to-consumer testing, also public health settings. So there are many different contexts. And I will note that there are discussions going on now in different states. I know in California they're starting to talk about using whole genome sequencing in a public health screening context. So this is a very timely discussion. I think Dr. Cowan already very nicely set up this idea that there's no one that doesn't have an interest. I think the policy framework that you use to look at an issue and look at what drives the issues are all based on different values. And so I think it would be it's useful to look at underneath and look at what values are driving these different sort of policy frameworks and decisions that are made on the basis of those. We have established diagnostic technology assessment frameworks. How do you look at a diagnostic technology that are evidence-based? But we also are facing sort of the socio-technological networks and the social pressures that make us susceptible to technological imperatives as well. And we always have to ask ourselves the question, just because we have a technology, does that mean we should use it, and in what situations? We also have, I think, a changing background of how data are used. And to the extent that many of the technologies you're looking at generate data, and what you're really looking at is how data are managed, owned, and to what extent should it be kept private. We have sort of different models now of how data should or should not be managed. And there's sort of sometimes a clash between sort of an open source model of data versus sort of a more protective model of data, as well as commercial interests. So I think if you look back on ethical frameworks that have already been developed in genetic testing, there's been a pretty strong consensus on several items. First, that they should serve, genetic testing should serve the best interest of the patient, that reporting information for which there is evidence of benefit should guide which information gets reported, that the benefit should outweigh the risks, that one should respect an individual's right to know and also the right not to know. So I think there's been over the years pretty strong consensus about this. And I think there's, just on the slide here, I have a number of different reports over the last almost 50 years from various professional societies, task force, and other groups that all have sort of reiterated these same principles. However, in recent times, in the last decade or so, we've begun to see an ethical shift away from that consensus. So I think it's important to think about incidental findings in the context of this sort of rumblings of an ethical shift that happened in the mid-2000s, where benefit was now seen in a broader context, not just as benefit to an individual, but benefit to a family. That's a completely different framework. And so this was, I think this shift was made in the context not of whole genome sequencing, but in the context of other technologies such as tandem mass spectrometry that has been used in newborn screening and now has resulted in the increase in the number of tests that are mandated in statewide newborn screening programs, from an average of about 5 per state to an average of about 50. So now here we are in the era of whole genome sequencing. And this ethical shift depended on developing new technologies that contained costs by screening for virtually all target conditions with one test system. And that's a quote from an article that was in the previous slide. But you can see that this describes whole genome sequencing pretty well. So there was this ethical shift that emphasized now the best interest of the family as opposed to the individual. And in the case of something like newborn screening, that means a particular child. And de-emphasizing autonomy. And I think some of this ethical shift is also reflected in the recommendations, the recent recommendations on incidental findings that Dr. Green is the lead author of and already mentioned. So I don't want to go over the recommendations again, but I will, I think it's worth looking at sort of the ethical arguments that underlie the recommendations. To actively search, to not offer patients preferences about receiving results, and to not make distinctions in age for reporting, for example, late onset adult conditions associated with genes. First, there was, I think, an argument and articulation of the fiduciary duty that clinicians and laboratory personnel have to prevent harm, but also then a recognition that performing tasks to mask analysis of a whole genome, because you're not going to give somebody their data for their entire genome, would be unwieldy and perhaps place an unrealistic burden on laboratories, and that the amount of genetic counseling needed to discuss unrelated conditions might be overwhelming. Although it did acknowledge that the patients do have the right to decline clinical sequencing. As well, there was an argument about respecting the parental rights about children's health, but you could also argue that not providing preferences to receive results is also a challenge to autonomy. In addition, there was an argument made that findings should be reported to children because their parents do not have ready access to sequencing at this time, and perhaps that might become different as costs drop. But there's sort of you can see this argument about benefiting a larger group of people other than the individual whose clinical case is in question. I'm not really going to go over the analogies that were in the report, but I do think it's well worth the Commission's time to look very seriously at the ways in which different technologies are analogous or are not analogous in this context. And I think the most important thing is that the recommendations acknowledge that there's insufficient evidence about benefits, risks, and costs of disclosing incidental findings to make evidence-based recommendations at this point. And I think one of the major issues that I think is salient in whole genome sequencing is the idea of looking at the risks and benefits at this time with the state of the technology at this moment. And I would argue that the potential harms may not come from when somebody gets information if it's correct, but that this information may be actually incorrect, and that there's actually a high probability or not insignificant probability that whole genome sequencing information is actually not correct at this moment. Now, the FDA and NIST are working together to try to develop minimal standards for sequencing quality, but there's studies that show that there are a wide variety of sequencing platforms that have different results. When you send the same sample to 2 different labs, the concordance of, for example, single nucleotide variants may be 88%. Of other kinds of variants like insertions and deletions may be as low as 26%, meaning that there are hundreds of thousands of variants per genome that are not in concordance when sent to 2 different laboratories if they're using different platforms, or even 2 different laboratories using the same platform. So analytic validity is not assured with this technology at this point. There's also interlab variability of the humans who are interpreting that information, and I think it's very important to understand that interpreting the information is very dependent on the data that we have already from other genotype-phenotype correlations. So you can't interpret a new genome unless you know what happened with all the other genomes before it, and a lot of that information is actually proprietary and not accessible to most labs. And I think that's a very important policy point, that independent of patents and patents on genes and ownership, that people who are collecting genotype-phenotype information are able to keep that information proprietary, which makes it very difficult for clinicians to interpret new genetic information. Also, if genomics are used to test what are essentially low-risk or asymptomatic populations for very rare conditions, the predictive value of those tests will go way down to the extent that the false positives may actually exceed the true positives. So I think it's important to consider how interpretation of genomic information specifically is very resource intensive. So I think that challenges the idea of what an incidental finding actually means in genomics, because the data do not present themselves sort of in black and white. They have to be extensively analyzed and require broad expertise. And there are also opportunity costs. I think there's data that have recently come out suggesting that follow-up costs may be in the hundreds to thousands of dollars per variant that comes out that is reported. So I think there'll be a lot more evidence of that and information about that in the coming months that is published. So I'll just conclude by saying that the decisions about limits or obligations to report incidental findings should be based on established ethical principles and evidence, and the technology has changed, but the ethical principles per se may not have. And if there is a reason to change those ethical principles, that should be very carefully considered. But that evidence about harms and benefits are lacking.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cho. A terrific trio to begin with, and we're open for questions and comments by commission members. Nelson, why don't you begin?
So I was very intrigued by this discussion of lists that you raised, Dr. Green. And I think Dr. Cho's comments at the end, I think, probably solidified my thought process on this. So I assume, and I haven't read the guidelines yet, and I apologize, I'll be doing that later on today. But are you saying that there is going to be some sort of panel that would look yearly at those polymorphisms that would be recommended to be passed along to clinicians? And if that's the case, who sits on that panel? Because the selection of those genes, I mean, just in terms of how many polymorphisms you're going to provide to clinicians, what type of polymorphisms, what disciplines would be included on that panel? Obviously, not just medical geneticists, but also potentially ethicists. There are a whole series of questions, and one possibility, and you raised this yourself in your own presentation, is that if you know that you have a polymorphism that makes you potentially more susceptible to disease that currently we can't do much about, at least not medically, although one could do lifestyle preparations. But there might be things you could do for cardiovascular risk. That would be something that you would be more interested in. So this is a really nuanced set of conditions. I mean, I'm thinking about why would a gene like a CCR5 polymorphism that would triage your risk for HIV acquisition, that might be something that you want to obtain in Irish that live in Chelsea and Revere in your city, but probably will be of little value in Chinese that live in Palo Alto because the polymorphism frequency is so low. So it's really, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, but how would you distill it to practice?
Well, it's a great question, and I think astute observation about what would happen if you have access to the entire genome, and you had to try to bring to bear some sort of judgment on this extraordinary wealth of information, pharmacogenomic, common complex variants. But we didn't do that. In our ACMG recommendations, we started asking, at this moment in time, what are the absolute minimum number of conditions and variants that we believe you wouldn't want to miss. And so really this list is only made up of things like what we believe are fairly penetrant cancer predisposition syndromes, sudden cardiac death syndromes, and a very few others. So it's 24 conditions and 57 genes. There's only one pharmacogenomic thing on there, which is the hyperthermia with anesthesia. There are no common complex variants on there, such as the GWAS studies preserve. And they're rare. We're not sure how frequently they would be found, but we imagine that between 1 in 100 and 1 in 200 people would ever flag positive on one of these, which is why it's a short list and a low prior probability. Now, the question about false positives is a reasonable question, but I'll stop there.
Could I just to make your answer more complete, and either you or Dr. Cho could answer this, the absolute minimum, on what criteria or criterion do you base that absolute minimum?
Well,
It sounds like a
Yeah.
really great absolute this is the absolute minimum, but what's the foundation on which you determine, or what are the criteria you determine what the absolute minimum?
Well, first, professional organizations have used their collective clinical expertise to design recommendations for practice. That is an established practice. They're not all thoroughly evidence-based, and this one, we admitted up front, was not fully evidence-based. But the criteria we used were, on the rare side of things, the more common of the rare variants, conditions that had relatively high penetrance, as best we could tell from their evidence and our clinical experience, conditions in which there was a period of time you could make an effective intervention and make a clinical difference, and conditions in which there was basically the group collected and the additional reviewers that we collected and the board of the ACMG agreed should not be missed. So there's a continuum starting from the most obvious thing that no one would ever want to miss to things that everybody agrees are completely ridiculous. And there is no break point in that continuum.
Jim?
Actually like to follow that, but with a question to Dr. Cho. We have sort of just offhandedly said that incidental findings are those findings that come about of things that we weren't really looking for. But now we have someone proposing a list of things that one ought to be looking for. My question is, what does it mean not to be looking for something? You're trying to hang a definition, or trying to hang some parameters on that, but your presentation seemed to be at a broader level than just genomics, and that's why I was That's why I thought I might pick on you first, but of course, all the panels. But what does it mean not to be looking for something, and is that really the right definition that we should be using? In fact, Lisa's presentation suggested that an alternative definition should be not what the test was ordered for, as opposed to not what is an incidental finding, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I'm actually one of those people that doesn't believe that incidental findings is very helpful in the context of genomics. Partly because I think this idea of data sort of popping out at you and being unexpected doesn't really reflect, I think, the way that genomic data have to be analyzed, because it is it has to be interpreted in a way, and you have to decide what things you're going to look for, especially when you have a massive amount of information. So you have to filter that out.
So we can't do a parallel thing in imaging, or?
Well, I mean, I think some radiologists would argue that some of the imaging technologies are similar in that it's a bunch of digital stuff, and that it doesn't just sort of pop out on the screen. It has to be determined how the data go from this digital form to an image that can be read, and then it's further interpreted by a human. So I think all of this stuff is very interpreted through a filter that is pre-developed, and so that you can bias the results in ways that you determine before you even look at the data. But I think that some of the work that's been done recently at Dr. Atkinson's institution in Kansas City illustrate sort of one approach that they use for whole genome sequencing in newborns that had very severe life-threatening conditions. And one of the things they did was to establish a way of sorting through the data and only selecting particular things that were likely to be associated with the symptoms that were being expressed in a patient at that time, and not looking at anything else. So I think that sort of represents one way of approaching the problem that doesn't necessarily lead you to look at a bunch of other stuff that isn't relevant. So that does sort of fit your definition, or the definition that was put forward before, about sort of what are you ordering the test for? Why are you doing it?
Nita.
So I think it's a fascinating idea that there could be a minimum list. I imagine it'd be incredibly challenging with lobbying groups, et cetera, trying to actually get theirs on there. But I want to go in a slightly different direction. One thing that you noted was that this isn't about asking patient preferences. And Mildred, you put up there the idea of the right not to know, a concept that maybe we're moving away from. But I'd like to understand that. I mean, is there such a thing as a right not to know? And if there is such a thing as a right not to know, does that include a right of others not to know, or just my own right to remain in the dark? And how is that taken into account in the kind of model that was proposed here about not taking into account patient preferences? Because I gather if you're giving the information to the physician or the person who's ordered the test, then patient preferences are taken into account, which would imply that there's no right of others not to know, just your own potential preference. So I was hoping, each of you could speak to that concept if it's relevant to your thoughts.
Sure. I think the model that we really looked to was the way that medicine is practiced in other domains. So if if you're seeing a dermatologist for a rash, and the dermatologist sees a mole beside that rash that looks like a melanoma, that dermatologist has a fiduciary duty to see that. If you have a chest X-ray up for your heart, and there's a lesion in a lung field, that radiologist systematically, it's with their eyes, not with a computer, but with their eyes, systematically has to examine that X-ray. And there's really no debate that they would not report back that finding if it was suspicious to the ordering clinician. So I think the point of view we came from, with a lot of thought over 14 months and a lot of diversity on this ACMG working group, and then with further thought and conversation with the ACMG board, was how do we de-exceptionalize whole genome and whole exome sequencing in the future practice of medicine. And with that regard, we felt we had to start somewhere. And so that's the analogy. It's not really about preference in a very low probability event. Because you can't imagine that dermatologist saying, before I examine your rash, let me tell you that I could find cancer, I could find a boil, I could find a pimple. It doesn't really have good meaning. Same thing with the X-ray.
Isn't that, so our job is to also figure out why. Why? Isn't that, to put it simply, because we agree, or it is the case to the extent that we agree, that that physician has a fiduciary duty to do that?
I believe so.
And so in the presence of a stipulated fiduciary duty, which goes unsaid because it is the background condition that we generally agree on, that follows. And so then the question is, how extensive is this fiduciary duty? How far does the analogy extend? I mean, do direct-to-consumer agents have the same fiduciary duty? I'm asking you that question, do they?
Let me just follow on that, which is, if the dermatologist is looking at my skin and notices that I have, freckles, which might predispose me eventually, if I spend a lot of time in the sun, toward developing melanoma, but I don't have melanoma next to my rash, you wouldn't think every single thing that I might be predisposed to, given, the pigmentation of my skin or anything else like that, would be included within the fiduciary duty of the physician to report back to me.
I agree.
That's two different things, which is, one, do you have the fiduciary duty? Two, what does it extend to?
Well,
And with general practitioners, the history is, when there were general practitioners, there were the instruments were less discerning, but the idea of the fiduciary duty was extensive. And it may be over time with direct-to-consumer, our sense of the fiduciary duty has narrowed while the ability to diagnostic techniques has broadened. And we are agents, so you have some influence, if not power, over this. So what we're asking you is what do you think the extent, who has the fiduciary duty, and what is the extent of it? And we could
I'd
go
love
down,
to hear what my
right, we could
co-panelists
go
think
down
from
the,
an ethical perspective. The ACMG working group and the ACMG board did not address direct-to-consumer. My personal opinion is that that consumer companies do not have the same fiduciary contract with their customers as a physician does with their patients. So that's my response to that.
Dr. Cho, Dr. Crowley?
Well, I agree with that about the fiduciary duty. I think that, Henry Richardson in his writings talks about sort of different models, entrustment models, as a contrast to a contractual model, which I think is more in line with a DTC kind of modus. So the fiduciary is very different than the contractual, and the researchers maybe occupy a different space too, which may be more in line with the entrustment type of model. But I do think the analogy is not quite exact. It doesn't fit perfectly for genomics with the mole on the face, because I think the mole is there. You see it. And presumably the dermatologist has the expertise to recognize that it's maybe a melanoma, as opposed to just a dot. The genomics is not the same in that it would be more like having to, it would be more like having to, have someone take off all their clothes as opposed to just noticing that there's something on somebody's face that you can see when they walk in. So it's in sort of recommending that findings be searched for actively. That's different. That I think that goes beyond the traditional fiduciary duties to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do in the course of a clinical encounter. I think once the finding is there, it may fall within the fiduciary duty to report that. But I also think that part of the melanoma example that may not fit with the genomics is this issue of the analytic validity. With the melanoma example, you have a sense of what the prognosis is going to be, you have a sense of what could be done to prevent it, you have a sense of the accuracy of your own diagnosis. I think none of that really holds with whole genome sequencing.
Ruth?
Thank you for asking me to respond to this. I have two observations. One is not as an historian, but as a patient. It seems to me that it is now standard practice for dermatologists to ask you to take all your clothes off. And so, in some sense, the fiduciary duty to observe has been enlarged. And possibly it's been enlarged because there are new technologies of observation, or at least a new system of observation for dermatology. The other thing I observed, which I am speaking as an historian about, in both Dr. Cho and Dr. Green's presentations is that there are shifts going on in fundamental bioethical principles. At the same time that you, Dr. Cho, also wanted to assure us all that the fundamental principles remain the same, but they don't. The fundamental principles, for example, about whether or not somebody has a right to know or a right not to know seem to be shifting.
May I respond just very
Sure,
quickly to one
absolutely.
thing Dr. Cho said? It is tricky with these analogies. They're like dueling analogies. But if I can just return to the melanoma analogy, it isn't typically that a doctor would say this is or is not a melanoma. They would see a lesion, and a probability would form in their mind as to whether this is a cancerous lesion, a precancerous lesion, high probability, low probability. So really, in all of clinical medicine, we're dealing with probabilities just as we are with genetic variants.
Important point. Anita? Yes.
My question / comment really follows up on Anita's question and on what Dr. Cohen just said about the right to know and shifting bioethical standards. But my question was inspired by your presentation, Dr. Green, because you were emphasizing that that this report suggests that doctors should receive the information and then presumably they would transmit it appropriately to their patient. But that makes me wonder hard about this idea of the right to know and about the shifting standards, which today I think suggest that patients really should be more in the driver's seat than that somewhat old-fashioned notion that you just described suggests. And in particular, under our current health privacy laws, all patients have a right to access their medical data. And they have a right not only to the narrative their doctor gives them, but they have a right to see the MRI, the lab report about their melanoma lesion. They have the right to see the x-rays, the brain scans. So how can we, in this context in which there's kind of a legal obligation to give it all up if the patient asks for it, how can we deal with the problem that I think motivated your group to think the data ought to go first of all, in the first instance, to the doctor? The patient's going to get it anyway, right, if they're at all curious. So what do you get by first transmitting data to doctors? And how do you reconcile that with this idea of a patient's right to know?
Great question. One word, contextualization. The most fundamental thing you get when it goes first to the doctor is the doctor's ability to soften, to warn, to reassure, to put it in the context of family history, to seek phenotypes that they might not otherwise have thought of, to get additional studies or not, to follow a patient. All of that is critically important to the interpretation of a genome, not simply handing a hard drive or even a report to somebody. Now, I do think people will ask for the hard drive. I think there'll be enthusiasts who do that, and I think that there'll be self-selected information seekers. I think that's a lot of what our research into genetic disclosure has taught us, is that there are information seekers who will go get this. But I predict that for the vast majority of human patients who end up getting sequenced in the next 10 years, they will turn to who they've always turned to, their clinician, and say, "Doc, help me understand what this means."
John?
A couple of issues I want to just continue gnawing on a couple of bones that have been thrown out there. So one is, in your opinion, Dr. Green, how many garden variety primary care providers are capable of providing that sort of contextualization right now?
I will be able to give you some answers, empirical answers on that when we complete our MedSeek experiment, in which we are giving primary care doctors 6 hours of orientation to genomics, and then we are letting them loose with whole genome sequencing in actual patients.
Well, it's reassuring to be told that an answer will be forthcoming. That's more than most philosophers will ever give you. Right?
Let me ask.
I had a second part. Is
Okay,
that
go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so Dr. Cho, on this issue of this trend that you're describing of an increase in respect for the welfare of the family, and on the other side, a decline perhaps in the salience of autonomy. Did you mean that to hold only in the realm of, say, pediatric genomics? Or would that be a statement that you'd make across the board? Because I'm wondering, like, how much of a concern for family well-being might be also described as a concern for family autonomy, right? You know, the parents deciding what kind of family they want. With regard to the decline in concern for autonomy, it does seem to me that all this emphasis on market-driven genomics indicates a resurgence, if anything, of autonomy. You know, these are my genes. I want to know about them, and I have a right to know about them.
Well, I think this broadening of the concept to family autonomy is something that I think has been argued not just in genomics. It's been something that's been coming up in pediatrics generally because of, and there's always been an undercurrent of that in genetics because of the involvement of whole families and implications of the results. So I don't think that's entirely new, but it is new that it sort of is coming up in the policy frameworks. I think there is a sort of empowerment argument that's made for direct-to-consumer genetics from genomics that is sort of along the lines of autonomy. But I also think, getting back to Nita's question about the right not to know, there's also, I think, an issue about not reporting things to, for example, children for late onset conditions, and there's been a pretty strong consensus that that's something that should not be done because of the autonomy issues there.
We are running over, but I want to give Dr. Cowan a chance to respond to this. Steve Hauser will ask a question. I'm going to have one question here. It's actually an important observation from a member of the audience, and then Dan and Christine will have first dibs at the next questioning, because otherwise we will start off running woefully behind. So, Dr. Cowan.
I had a question, not a comment, and it's a question for Dr. Cho. Your presentation focused on the benefit to families, but your slide read benefit to families and society. And I'm wondering if you'd just comment whether it's even possible to understand what the benefits to society are, let alone to practice.
Right. I mean, that was a quote from an article where it was this broadening of benefit was presented the broadening of newborn screening was presented as a benefit to society. That wasn't my argument.
Dr. Hauser.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Green, I might try to extend John's question into right to know or right to explore. Your data is, in fact, very tantalizing, where when you describe the impact of revealing the personal genomic information and the result in 10% frequency of additional tests or procedures performed. Obviously, that's well beyond the minimal list of disclosed conditions that are in your recommendations. And we know that clinicians often act through art as well as evidence. And I just might ask if you would comment on this, but also if you are ready, I understand this is a work in progress, to tell us about the types of procedures, give us some idea of the scope, iatrogenic complications, et cetera.
Thanks, Steve. I'm not actually, I don't have the data on what procedures they did yet for our direct-to-consumer. That data was just analyzed yesterday. But I think the question of, I think the minimum idea here is important. It's great to be in this position because we have gotten really criticized from both sides. The people have said how...
Since you must be doing...
People have said, how dare you want to look for this minimum list and promote it. A whole other group of people are saying, how dare you leave out all the other stuff in genomics that could be of tremendous value to people. And it really is, the thinking is really a minimum list. What is it that you just wouldn't want to miss, that you wouldn't be able to sleep? We actually said this in our deliberations. You wouldn't be able to sleep at night if you didn't talk to this. And Dr. Biesecker, who's here in the audience, actually has data through his ClinSeq project of finding some of these cancer predisposition variants in people who never suspected that they had them, and what sort of impact that had on their health care and how that played out. So, it's a work in progress. We specifically recommended two things that haven't gotten quite as much play. One is that these be amended at least annually as the science progressed. And two, that as was done when bone marrow work came out, that there should be some sort of national registry that tracks basic outcomes in people who receive incidental findings so that we can follow them and see if, in fact, we're doing good or harm.
Let me read a comment from a member of our audience, Alyssa Forrest. Alyssa, where are you? You'll correct me if I misread your handwriting.
Sorry, I'm slick.
Oh, no, it's better than mine. It's really good. Alyssa's a visiting scholar at the Feinstein Institute and a doctoral student at Malloy College. It is my opinion that this is a question for anybody who wants to comment. It's my opinion that under Richardson and Belsky's partial entrustment model, the fact that a research subject entrusts a dimension, not the whole, of his or her health to the investigator when he or she agrees to participate in a study is sufficient to require the investigator to report incidental findings to the subject, even if the findings do not reveal potentially seriously health risks. So I take that it's a question in the form of a comment. Do you agree that if a research subject entrusts a dimension, agrees to participate, that that's a sufficient reason, a responsibility to report back the finding?
Well, Henry told me he wasn't able to be here today, but so I don't want to put words in his mouth. But my interpretation of his entrustment model is that would depend on other factors. That there are other mediating factors about that come from the nature of the relationship and also the nature of the vulnerability. For example, I don't know if Christine, maybe you might be able to comment on that more.
Right, there are multiple dimensions that he builds into the model. The scope of the relationship, the strength of the relationship, the vulnerability of the persons that modify the extent to which you owe whatever you owe.
We owe a lot of thanks to Doctors Green, Cowan, and Cho, and we'll hear back from you at a panel later, but for now, thank you so very, very much.